That's me in engineering school. I did my own hair. I was hanging out with my progressive rock band, and for a moment we got pretty big. We were touring the country, playing in front of thousands of people, packed stadiums, and it felt real. Now the backdrop to this is that I really struggled in my high school STEM courses, but somehow managed to get myself into a half-decent engineering program where, of course, as you might imagine, I felt completely out of place. So knowing that, you might think standing on stage, playing in front of thousands of people, I might seriously consider music as a viable career option. But as the child of an educated middle-class family in India, engineering always felt serious. Music felt like some kind of phase I was going through. But that's the point. I never had the chance to actually reject music. Music never even entered into the realm of possibility about a future that I could potentially seriously consider and evaluate. And that's the point I want to discuss with you today. I want you to think back to the last 5 years of your lives and maybe pick one major decision perhaps you made in those years. Maybe picking a university, changing jobs, maybe you moved across the country, maybe you moved across continents. Maybe you ended a long-term relationship. Now here's the uncomfortable question. How many possible futures did you not consider when you took that decision? Perhaps when you took that new job, you didn't consider the option of trying to shape or reshape the role to really fit with who you are and what you wanted to achieve. Perhaps when you picked a university, you never considered the option of just starting a business instead. Perhaps when you moved across the country, you didn't consider the option of staying back and building a different life. Not because those options were not viable or impossible, but because for whatever reason, they just didn't feel legitimate enough for you to want to evaluate. We like to believe that our lives are shaped by the decisions we make. But what if the greatest forces in our lives are operating before we make those decisions, silently editing out our boldest instincts before we even get to see them and evaluate them? As an anthropologist, I study this invisible architecture of possibility. And today my goal is to try to make some of that architecture visible. Because our culture, driven by the unspoken norms and inherited expectations, it never blocks ideas. It just silently edits them before we even get a chance to see them. Let me show you something interesting. In 2011, researchers Walton and Cohen were studying the performance gap. So on average, they found that the GPA of black students trailed the GPA of white students in select universities in the US, despite similar academic preparation. So they hypothesized that this wasn't because of ability or intellect, but rather because of belonging uncertainty. So their hypothesis was that black students are in an environment where they don't feel like it's set up for them to succeed. It's not a place where they're supposed to thrive, and that affects motivation. That was the hypothesis, okay? So to test this, they took a group of first-year students and did a simple 1 hour-long intervention, a reading and writing exercise that delivered a heartfelt message to all students in this cohort, and it said something like, feeling out of place is common. We all experience it. We all feel uncertain about whether we belong, but don't worry, it's temporary. It will dissipate. That's it. A simple 1 hour intervention. You want to guess what happened? A few years later, the GPA gap reduced by half. Just from that simple 1 hour intervention. Nothing else changed. So what does that teach us? When we feel like something is not supposed to be for us, it's not built for us, we're not supposed to have this experience or be in this environment, we automatically reject it, subconsciously reject it from the possible futures that we consider. So we don't even actually consider it as an option. This is sort of what happened to my music career. I wasn't choosing between engineering and music. I wasn't choosing between A and B. I was choosing between A and whatever survived cultural elimination. That's architecture. The problem is, architecture doesn't forbid. It just edits our boldest instincts. And it edits them in the most subtle way to make us believe that the decisions we're making are just common sense. So it takes our boldest instincts and tells us, that's a little unrealistic. Isn't this the wrong time in your life to consider something like this? That's unreasonable. That's not for someone like you. And the problem is that we like to believe as human beings that we choose from the world as we see it, but actually we're choosing from the world as we feel is thinkable. And our thinkable universe is much narrower. Just like my music career sort of died on the vine, so did my passion for social anthropology. Because while in my engineering degree and while my colleagues were digging into textbooks on soil mechanics and thermodynamics, I developed this obsession with human behavior. This fascination with wanting to understand why human beings do what they do. How do we build beliefs? And how do our beliefs affect our motivations? What makes us feel a sense of belonging? I wanted to study social anthropology. So when it came time to think about a master's program, I fell into the same trap all over again. An MBA felt serious, like the right thing to do, and social anthropology felt indulgent, dare I say. And so I moved to Canada, got myself an MBA degree, got a great job in advertising. On paper, I was killing it, doing really well. I was a success. But inside, I was deeply unfulfilled. It's not that I'd chosen the wrong future, it's just that I'd mistaken cultural default for personal desire. But don't worry, this is not some sob story about failed dreams, because years later, I ended up founding a company, marrying my love for anthropology and AI, and it went on to advise some of the biggest corporations in the world, helping them understand how human belief systems shape behavior. And what I realized then is that the very thing that I had once considered as an indulgence ended up shaping the foundation or becoming the foundation of everything I now do, the reason I wake up in the morning. In fact, even sociologists have argued this for decades, that our field of vision, what we see as the realm of possibilities, constantly shaped by the world around us in a way that we almost never notice. Famously, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, sociologists, wrote about the social construction of reality, how unspoken norms over time solidify into common sense. Pierre Bourdieu wrote about habitus, the structured patterns in which we interpret the world around us. They decide what feels natural, reasonable, respectable, logical, and what doesn't. And the problem is when something starts feeling natural, it starts feeling true. And this is how normalization works and limits us. Normalization never says, don't do it. It never forbids. It only narrows your sense of imagination. Let me share with you a great example of a person that navigated this extremely well. Here's Dominique Brown. Her collaboration with national retailers across the United States has transformed how Black art now shows up on mainstream retail shelves, especially in home decor. But she didn't start there. She had a career in marketing, was moving homes, and realized she couldn't find art and home decor items that represented her culture. Now, was she the first one to discover that? Of course not. So then what made her achieve all this success while perhaps many of her predecessors couldn't? Was she smarter than everybody else? Was she luckier? You know, I think in our culture, when we hear about entrepreneurial success stories like these, we love to say, oh yeah, it was courage. She took the bold step. But I think it's much more than courage, it's visibility. Because she was able to choose an option that was not on her standard menu. It was not an option that she was supposed to take. And by the way, this pressure to narrow our sense of imagination doesn't just happen at a personal level, it also happens professionally. Think about the number of organizations where people don't speak up in meetings because that's not how you're supposed to share an idea. Or the number of innovations that might die in people's heads because it doesn't resemble a past success story. Or perhaps the number of leadership profiles that never see the light of day because it doesn't match a fixed template. This is the problem with this invisible architecture. It rewards continuity, and it makes any kind of deviation feel unrealistic. Organizations don't struggle just because they're resisting change. They often struggle because all the other options, the alternatives, just don't seem realistic enough. They don't seem legitimate enough to pursue. This brings us to the point of illumination, because illumination is not about rebellion. It's about recognition. It's about that moment when you realize that this isn't some kind of force of nature. This isn't some kind of rule I'm supposed to follow. Instead, the pressure I'm feeling, the reason my instincts are getting edited, is because of a framework that is built around us, that our communities, our circles around us build for us unknowingly. And the moment you start to realize and see this architecture, something subtle but powerful shifts within you. For me, for example, it finally helped me distinguish between cultural default and personal constraint. And that subtle shift itself was transformational. Now, when we started today, I asked you to think about the biggest decision you have made in the last 5 years. I want to go back to that, but let's tackle that from a slightly different lens. Now let's think about one possible future, one possible pathway that you never considered when you made that big, bold decision. Perhaps you didn't consider it because it didn't feel legitimate enough. It wasn't for someone like you. It was unreasonable. It was not realistic. I want you to pick one such possible path that you didn't consider. And I want you to interrogate it in your mind. What do I mean by that? Ask yourself the question, why did I not consider this as an option, as a viable option? Was it because of my own abilities, my own capacity, what I feel I'm capable of? Or was it architecture? Was it the invisible architecture at work? The biggest constraints in our lives, they rarely arrive as prohibitions. They arrive as common sense, everyday decisions. This is why they're so dangerous. The biggest constraints arrive as common sense, everyday decisions. And the moment we start to see this invisible architecture, the moment we start to recognize even parts of this invisible architecture, it loses its power over you. You can suddenly choose to work within it, bend it, reshape it, build something beside it. But the point is that you are now choosing consciously, and that changes everything. Thank you.